Only 30% of you guys are on Intel CPUs. 10 years ago, I would have thought this poll would be completely flipped. And it seems like in the coming years, that number is only going to grow. But why is that? Is it because Intel CPUs are basically compact space heaters nowadays? Or because almost 100% of them are failing? And we don't even know if that issue is actually solved? Or is it because on Intel you have to buy a new motherboard and RAM almost every single generation? Or is it because AMD is just that much better? By the look of it, there just isn't a major reason to get an Intel CPU. So it'd be a really stupid decision if... I'm about to do the stupidest thing ever. I'm gonna get an Intel CPU and motherboard. Is it really that bad?
AMD for the win, guys. Don't be an Intel.
There's tons of Intel CPUs available, and they're at some amazing prices too, probably because so many people are out here buying Intel. The 13700K specifically struck me as a really crazy deal at $300. That's only like 2 boxes of RGB fans.
I think this is the better deal. It has RGB.
Yeah, it's honestly a lot faster.
And honestly, that's not AMD, buddy.
Yeah, you must be an idiot if you're not buying AMD.
It took me a while to figure out motherboards, but eventually I ended up picking up the Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Elite X Wi-Fi 7. It's a decently high-end board, so I'm giving this CPU the best chance that I possibly can. But when I was about to check out at Micro Center, an employee literally told me straight to my face that she would never go with Intel, and she did not understand why I was. An employee, someone who's trying to sell me the product, told me specifically not to buy it. That was before any of these degradation problems really came up. I bought this CPU back in May. I ended up returning this specific CPU in July and then got a different one. We're gonna cover why I had to do that later on in the video. I finally got home with my new space heater. Putting it together was interesting. The motherboard, it's very nice, very premium, at least to me.
You can see the VRMs, they gotta be beefy. Tons of USB, 2.5 gig LAN. Intel's been ahead with I/O and stuff for quite a while. Amp up audio, some of the highest in audio you can get on a motherboard. Giant heatsink for the 2 SSD. I don't even think that's at all necessary.
Installing the CPU was a bit freaky.
Just like that. I haven't done Intel in so long. Can I even install a CPU anymore? Wow, it does feel very tight. And that wouldn't surprise me if that bends the CPU. That's the thing, is these are known for bending the CPU. It is very, almost unnaturally tight.
When I install AMD CPUs, it doesn't feel like this. It doesn't feel like I'm breaking the CPU to install it. This 13700K is a 250 watt CPU, which is a lot of watts. And that means it needs a lot of cooling. So you might call me crazy.
So this guy was working on my AMD system with the 7800X3D. Let's see if this can handle the Intel one. I'm a little masochist, so I'm gonna try that.
I will mention that putting on the cooler itself on the Intel system was quite a bit more intensive than it is on AMD typically. I don't know if that's exactly Intel's fault. Then I removed the RAM from my AMD system.
So this RAM is not allowed to have fun. Yeet. Don't worry, it's fine. Intel's now. Go check out my socks. Diet Coke.
From this point forward, there's no going back to AMD. My sweet, sweet 7800X3D. I will miss you. I don't know what I'm more scared of at this point. The amount of heat that this new system is going to produce, or if my power supply is going to explode. It is only a 750 watt power supply.
I hit the power switch.
This is probably the bravest thing that I've ever done. That is pressing the power button.
Here we are. We're in BIOS.
I guess it hasn't exploded yet. That's a relief. But let's just give it some time. I was instantly bombarded upon booting it up by all this Intel Boost technology in the BIOS.
Speed shift technology. I don't know what these even are. Or energy efficient turbo. Turbo boost technology. Dynamic tuning technology.
How many ways are there for Intel CPUs to destroy themselves with power? All this boosting stuff. Why is there so much shit here? I don't understand. Then I went into Windows.
Oh yeah, baby, we in Windows now. Hopefully I can trust Intel Corporation. Hopefully.
The weirdest part is that everything functions completely fine. Everybody is avoiding these things like the plague. Intel CPU is gonna be awful, but no, it's perfectly fine experience. I blew this bag out. Yeah, guys, I think 13700K works. I think it works. And I haven't personally used an Intel CPU since I built my first computer in 2016. It had an i5 2500, that thing is old as balls, and a humble 8 gigabytes of RAM. I've never really looked back to the Intel system ever since I went to Ryzen in the beginning of 2018. At this point in time, Intel is pretty foreign to me, but this Intel system doesn't just work. It impresses me. By the way, this system feels really snappy, man. Not exactly what it is about it, but it feels real snappy. Maybe this is due to the extra 8 efficiency cores, which is pretty wild, that help pick up background tasks. Maybe it's the really high clock speed that the Intel CPU hits, or maybe it's just Windows optimizing for Intel. But that doesn't really have a damn thing to do with the performance. I feel like it's time. I need to see this computer. Can this cooler work? I don't know. Let's turn it on. That's what it looks like, by the way, when it turns on. Now let's hit the multi-core button. 96 degrees. It's red hot. I think it stops at 95, right? 100 degrees. Holy shit! It's peaked at 100 degrees, boys. Watching that temperature climb on this little air cooler gave me an anxiety attack. It's like I put my hand near it, and it's like this thing is just radiating heat. I can feel that. Space heater, it lives up to its name. We're gonna talk about this whole temperature situation a little bit later. Let's put that on the back burner. This little guy may be a bomb waiting to explode, but the performance is pretty amazing. I mean, 24 threads, 8 performance cores at 5.3 gigahertz, 8 efficiency cores at 4.2. This thing rips, and just look at the score. What surprises me the most is just how close this 13700K is to my 7800 X3D in gaming. I mean, the 7800 X3D is generally speaking the fastest gaming CPU in the world. I ran these through 14 games. Alan Wake 2, Baldur's Gate 3, Cyberpunk, Dragon's Dogma 2, Hellblade 2, Horizon Forbidden West, Last of Us Part 1, Overwatch 2, Plague Tale Requiem, Remnant 2, Starfield, Avatar, and Spider-Man Miles Morales. All this on the RTX 4080 Super, which is pretty much the second fastest graphics card that's available, so it should isolate the CPUs as much as I possibly can. The biggest gap in these games is Baldur's Gate 3. The 7800 X3D is leading by a massive 24%. I do have up top here the average frame rate and the 1% low performance just to the right of it. 1% lows, the lower they go, shows if the game is stuttering or not. And the percentages of how these compare is right below that. The next biggest game here is Overwatch 2. 1080p on medium settings is 12% faster on the 7800 X3D. That translates to about 65 more FPS, which does sound like a lot, but when you are over 500 FPS, I mean, both these CPUs are really fast, so it doesn't end up being that eventful in this game. What you might feel more is the 1% lows. The 7800 X3D is 18% better here. Again, they are both still very great. Last of Us Part 1 is 12% ahead on the 7800 X3D, going from 156 FPS to an average of 174. Cyberpunk is 11% faster, which is pretty nice. It does get you up over 180 FPS in a pretty CPU intensive scene here. Plague Tale Requiem is led by 9% on AMD, as well as Starfield is 7% ahead. So yes, the 7800 X3D is faster in quite a few games. Most games, really. What I find interesting though is even at 1080p, paired with the second fastest GPU in the world, really, at least consumer side, the CPUs still aren't always fast enough to overtake the GPU and become CPU limited. Like for example, in Alan Wake 2, both of these CPUs are capable of letting the 4080 Super run as fast as it can, which is very fast still. Like these are both very, very acceptable performances. In Hellblade 2, it's the same story. In Remnant 2, they're practically the same, although somehow the 7800 X3D actually has worse 1% load performance here. I don't know why, but it does. It is very interesting to see in Spider-Man, the 7800 X3D is actually 6% slower. This isn't the norm by any means. This is really the only game that the AMD CPU is slower. So yeah, like these CPUs are fast enough to go head to head in a lot of cases. And this isn't really to knock on the 7800 X3D. It is still the faster gaming CPU when it is limited. The question is though, does it matter? The i7 here isn't really that far behind. And the only main game where you actually notice a difference is in Baldur's Gate 3. You know, on the 13700K, what is there really to say? Like, that performance is still really good. It's just not as good as the AMD one. I do feel that the 13700K performance is no slouch in games. This is still a very fast gaming CPU. And this comes even more into play when you aren't CPU limited. I showed all of the tests before at 1080p, which is more likely to be CPU limited, but let's do a bit of a real talk for a second. These are over $300 CPUs. I don't think many of you buying these CPUs are probably playing at 1080p. I also ran all of these games at 1440p. And in every single one, the extra performance on the 7800X3D makes absolutely no difference because they all become GPU limited. The only exception is in Cyberpunk when I turn on DLSS quality, but that's basically running it at 1080p anyways. And it probably doesn't surprise you that jumping up to 4K is the exact same story. Everything is graphics card GPU limited at that point in time. There's not a single scenario where we're CPU limited at 4K. So being realistic for everyone, it functionally does not matter which one of these CPUs you are using unless for some reason you're buying these amazing systems with a 4080 Super, $1,000 graphics card, and you're gonna be playing at 1080p, which I guess is possible. It's just pretty unlikely. Although there's one area where I think it's huge for the 7800X3D being faster. That little bit of extra performance is going to greatly help, as hopefully GPUs are gonna keep getting faster and outpace CPUs more and more. And hopefully, you know, it's all betting on this, these GPUs actually become affordable into the future. I know this is asking a lot from these companies, apparently, that it's impossible to make an affordable GPU anymore. The reason I harp so much on this rather close gaming performance of these CPUs is because it is a major reason why people, and me too, have been choosing AMD, is the gaming performance. 7800X3 is amazing. The thing is, the Intel one isn't beating it, but it is really right up there in gaming. And then the 13700K has another trick up its sleeve, and is that it has insane productivity performance, making it the fastest CPU that I own. I know the 7800X3D isn't really meant for all core productivity performance, but to put the 13700K into perspective, in Cinebench R24, 59% faster than the AMD CPU, going from 1091 to 1733. That is an insane score. It's massive. And you can see these tests running at 3 times speed just to, you know, make it quick for you guys. Side by side here and just see how much of a difference that really is. And then when you look at the price, the 13700K compares decently to the Ryzen 7700X, not the 7800X3D, which from my research might get around 1231 points in Cinebench when it's absolutely maxed out in power, which is faster than the 7800X3D I have here, but still the 13700K is destroying that CPU. And in Blender, the 13700K is brutal, leading by almost 60% overall. When encoding video through Handbrake on X264, the 13700K finishes 25% faster than the 7800X3D. You can just see that little progress bar just scurry along on the i7 CPU. It's just so satisfying. And on X265, it finishes 18% faster, and with AV1, it gets a massive lead of 31% faster. Now, SVT AV1, the software encoder I'm using here, is developed by Intel, so it does probably work better on their CPUs, I mean, go figure. But it doesn't really change the fact that the Intel CPU is kind of destroying the AMD one in this case. What surprises me most about this video work is that this Intel CPU, it has an integrated GPU on it, and you usually think that that sucks, but that integrated GPU can do hardware acceleration with video. And it is quick. I guess that's why they call it quick sync. It goes from 3 minutes 43 seconds on software, so using the cores, to 3 minutes 3 seconds on quick sync. And all at the same time, it's barely sipping on power and it's running super cool. To give you a reference of just how fast the quick sync is, my RTX 4080 Super also has hardware encoding. It's a big beefy GPU. This little integrated graphics card or GPU on the CPU here actually beats a $1,000 graphics card. Like, what? iGPUs are supposed to suck. The same thing with H.265. QuickSync beats the RTX 4080 Super at 2 minutes, 57 seconds. Damn. Unfortunately, you can't do AV1 encoding on the iGPU here. I'm guessing newer generations of Intel CPUs, when they come out, will be able to do that. Then I didn't even know that the 7800X3D has hardware encoding. So I was like, oh, okay, I'll go ahead and compare these. Now let's just say that the 13700K with QuickSync destroys the AMD encoding here. It isn't even close. So with all this great productivity performance paired with QuickSync on the Intel CPU, I've actually edited some videos on this CPU and I've been very impressed. Surprisingly, I can even disable the graphics card, the RTX 4080 Super, which usually does the bulk of my video editing. Guys, that's really impressive. I can still have solid performance because of that QuickSync encoder and decoder. It is a beast. Though, you know, sometimes when I get to like 4K 60 FPS, the kind of frame rate and resolution I use in my videos, it can push the iGPU kind of hard. It can kind of struggle at some points, but it still surprised me. How the hell does this thing do this? When it comes to CPU productivity performance, it's kind of funny because it gets mogged by dedicated graphics like a lot of the time today. Like just look at the 4080 Super, how it rolls in Cinebench. You blink and that thing's already done with a pass. Maybe CPU productivity isn't a massive deal all the time nowadays with all-core performance, but you can't deny that having a super fast CPU makes things extremely snappy. I think that's part of the reason why I feel like this Intel CPU is so snappy, and it undoubtedly does help you manage really large projects as things get more and more CPU demanding. So suffice to say, it is a beast in productivity performance and is pretty close in gaming performance to the best that is out there. The i7 here only costs $300 compared to the 7800X3D, which has technically gone as low as $340. That's still $40 more, but goddamn, this CPU itself has been hitting $400 lately. At the moment, the Intel CPU is offering phenomenal value. The problem is the platform costs, buying into a dead platform on Intel, whereas, you know, you could upgrade into the future on AMD. I'll go into that a little bit later in the video, but Intel CPU itself, just the CPU cost, is pretty amazing right now though. I might be crazy, but I kind of think it's getting a little hot in here, guys. Is it just me? I mean, that CPU performance has got me really distracted and caught up. I kind of forgot that I bought this thing to be a space heater, not a CPU. You might have noticed this silly little number throughout all these tests I've been showing you, like, damn, why is that shit twice as much on the Intel side compared to the AMD side? You might have noticed that during the tests against the AMD CPU, I actually swapped out the tiny cooler and I swapped it into a quite a bit bigger dual tower air cooler. Because yeah, the tiny one is a mistake. In order for the CPU with the tiny cooler to not destroy itself, which isn't the only time Intel CPUs can destroy themselves, it has to throttle itself really hard. At the beginning of a Cinebench run, it starts at around 4670 megahertz for the clock speed, and it's at 228 watts of power. But by the end of the test, it's at 4450 megahertz and down to 200 watts of power. Those are some major drops as the CPU is just gasping for air. Oh God, please save this poor CPU. You can't have a cooler like this on an Intel CPU. Dealing with the insane power draw of it is a hefty task. What about the Big Daddy air cooler? This is the DeepCool AK620, and it's technically rated for 260 watts of heat, so it technically can handle this i7 processor. Against the small cooler, which is the AN600, the big one maintains a good bit more performance in an all-core workload, just to give you an idea at its max power draw. With the big cooler, it didn't throttle. You know, it's sticking to 4750 megahertz throughout the entire test, which is sick, I guess. You know, crazy to see 250 watts on a CPU. That is just insane. Kudos though, it was keeping the room super warm at 250 watts. Thank God, I would have froze to death. 94 degrees though is still really hot, even for a really big air cooler. I mean, this thing is struggling to keep up with it. It is technically safe according to Intel because the TJ max of the CPU is 100 degrees. But I don't know nowadays how much we should really be trusting Intel about anything. Funny thing I realized when comparing these two coolers, is that if a CPU is running hotter, like physical temperature is hotter, then just that heat makes the CPU less efficient. Like in Last of Us Part 1 at 1080p here, they're hitting the same FPS with the same clock speed, but the little cooler on the right is running 14 degrees higher, which is making it draw 5% more power to achieve the exact same performance and clock speeds. So cooling your CPU better does actually have general efficiency benefits other than, you know, just the overall performance. So maybe running your shit at full throttle isn't really the play. So if you actually want to control this beast of a CPU, well, you're gonna need water cooling. There is just something about water cooling that I don't like. Oh. Sometimes you turn on your PC and it just sounds like it's leaking all over your shit, and you paid hundreds of dollars for this, it's just pissing all over it. But this Arctic Liquid Freezer 3 is a great cooler. I've tested it many times before. It still hasn't pissed on anything, so I think we're pretty good. We are able to get the temperature down under 90 degrees. Thank God. Yippee. Other than that though, the performance is exactly the same on the water cooling versus the big air cooler, you know, minus the efficiency gains you get from running cooler. So there isn't a major advantage running water cooling, but I don't like my CPU running, you know, close to 100 degrees all the time. So at least it's below that. And I realize that I've been yapping about power consumption and cooling for a really long time now, but this is a significant issue. I think a lot of people just look up the performance of a CPU or something like that, and they just said, that's a fast CPU, I'm gonna get that one. They have no idea what it's gonna be living with it. And why aren't you getting the performance you expected because of the temperatures and everything? Especially, you know, for me here, it's interesting because I run an open air system. Like, it's pulling in fresh air, it is ideal. You know, most people actually use a case to protect their PC. I'm kind of a freak about this. Trying to get full performance out of this CPU is a challenge. And can you even afford to physically fit the proper cooling that your PC or your CPU needs? Can you fit it in that case? If you can't do that, do you want your shit be bumping up to like 100 degrees all the time? And also, personally for me, I hate if my PC is so loud. Like, what if my fans are just blasting all the time trying to control this thing? Well, living with it could really suck. On the other hand, it is hard to understate how easy it is to cool the Ryzen 7800 X3D. A huge plus about it. My friend was actually running his without a cooler. Literally just a bare CPU getting cooled passively by the airflow of a ceiling fan or something. It's just getting cooled by hopes and prayers. But somehow it was still working. I don't recommend you do this. You can basically grab any small, cheap air cooler or something and just run this 7800 X3D, but you have to prioritize cooling for an Intel one. You need to be thinking about that. Just look at these two CPUs on the same big air cooler in Last of Us Part 1 at 1080p. This test was supposed to be completely CPU limited. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite. Also, if you do look over the Intel side, you can see that the clock speeds are lower on the Intel CPU compared to the AMD one. It's not exactly true because the Intel one is taking into account the efficiency cores, which clock quite a bit lower than the performance cores. So that brings the average clock down. You can see that the performance cores are usually clocking at about 5300 megahertz. Both of these CPUs are achieving about the same FPS, but the 13700K is doing that same thing at like 150% more power, which bumps the total system power consumption with the RTX 4080 Super from 365 watts to 497. Remember, I have a 750 watt power supply and this is like 500 watts on the Intel one. What the f is happening? And you will notice that the 7800 X3D is actually running hotter despite drawing so much less power and being on the same cooler. The reason I'm kind of dismissing this and kind of talking around it is because the CPU temperature on the 7800 X3D doesn't really even change even if you throw a water cooler on it. I think this is because AM5 in general has a cooling problem. Also, the 3D V cache makes it harder to cool, and the temperature sensor probably is in a different place for both of these CPUs, so it isn't directly comparable. I would kind of write off the temperature comparisons on this head-to-head, but the 13700K's inefficiency continues as we go up to 4K, when the game is completely GPU limited. We're looking at 120 watts versus 55 watts, pushing the total system power consumption to 488 watts versus 392. This is a massive difference, and this is also more of a situation where more people will find themselves in, being GPU limited, not CPU limited. If we lock the FPS to 60 to test frame rate efficiency, I will say that 13700K drops significantly in power, but it's still over 2 times the power because the 7800 XRD is also running more efficiently. So yeah, Intel has just been blasting power to get any sort of meaningful performance out of the past few years of CPUs, which I guess is okay if you have the cooling to support it. Like, it can draw a lot of power if you can cool it. But what I find really weird about these Intel CPUs, there's no way to make them like easily draw less power. For example, on Ryzen CPUs, they can also draw a lot of power. Like the 7950X really isn't that far behind like a 13900K or something. And on my personal rig, the 5900X, it also gets up to like 140 watts under full load. However, AMD does give you an option right there in the BIOS to turn on eco mode, which can bring you down to much more reasonable power depending how aggressive you go with the eco mode. Sometimes the performance hit isn't even that large because it does hit the efficiency curve of the CPU better, so you might not actually lose that much performance. But what is so bizarre is on the Intel system, there's no like one-click easy solution that can be found to quickly and efficiently make your CPU draw less power. Unless you want to count like disabling the E-cores as an eco mode. It is neat that you can disable them for any reason if you want to, but I frankly don't think that cutting off 8 cores of my CPU and cutting my CPU performance down by about 1/3 to really be a great solution to this problem, though it does draw quite a bit less power when you do so. Granted, I am saying this shit all about a specific BIOS from Gigabyte, and there is other motherboard makers that might have settings that I'm not aware of. But we do know how notorious Intel is for not regulating motherboards. Although I did want to try to get this power consumption under control, so I did try undervolting the CPU using Intel's Extreme Tuning utility, which you can download separately, it's not built in or anything. I am able to achieve an 80 millivolt undervolt on the specific CPU. Basically what this does is help the CPU run more efficiently by reducing the overall voltage while retaining the clock speed as much as possible. This reduces the temperatures at a slight hit to performance, but actually sometimes it can improve your performance if your CPU is power limited. Sadly, we do lose a little bit of performance, 1733 at stock and 1664 with the undervolt. That's a 4% reduction in Cinebench score. However, check out that temperature difference. 96 degrees to 83 degrees with the undervolt. So 4% less performance for 14% lower temperatures. That is massive, especially on the exact same cooler. You can see the power consumption dropped from 259 watts to 213 watts as well. I don't know what I did with the total power consumption here. I feel like I recorded these numbers wrong. I do these testing by hand and plug in the numbers by hand. Maybe I messed that part up. What I do find interesting is we are actually able to maintain the same clock speed even with the undervolt. So I'm not 100% sure where the performance loss is coming from, but do let me know if you know. And with the undervolt, the increased efficiency and lower temperatures applies to everything. In Last of Us Part 1, we see the undervolt performing virtually identical in terms of frame rate, but 18 watts lower and being much more chilly at 58 degrees. Overall, I do find that the undervolt is about 3% slower through all 14 games at 1080p. That doesn't really equate to that much loss in performance for how much easier it is to cool, how much less power it's gonna draw overall. Probably save you a decent amount of money. You can undervolt the CPU, and yeah, it does help. But let's be honest though, with undervolting, this is a power user thing. Turbo nerds can talk about this stuff, but most people don't even know what the fuck a voltage is. This brings me back to the practicality side. Generally, as many of you know and have probably noticed, the massive power consumption does only tend to be a problem when the CPU is under full load. But this full load scenario, this doesn't really happen that often. The small cooler versus the big air cooler, for example, in Last of Us Part 1 at 1440p. In both tests, the CPUs are hanging around 140 watts, and they're not under full load. We know that the max power consumption can be up to 250 watts. Obviously, the CPU temperature is quite a bit higher on the small cooler, but at the same time, it's not really affecting the overall gaming performance. Whereas we can check it out where it's more CPU limited at 1080p. The little air cooler is a little bit slower here, kind of unnoticeably slower. That is probably because the higher temperature is throttling the clock speeds of the CPU just a little bit, leading to less performance. And in a game like Overwatch 2 at 1080p CPU limited, the performance difference is kind of negligible. So unless you really are pushing the 13700K to its absolute limit in something like Cinebench, that doesn't really matter about the wild power consumption as much as probably a lot of people make it out to be, which gives me mixed feelings on the power consumption discussion for Intel. Besides the obvious upside of high power consumption, you know, winter's coming and I need a space here to keep me warm, Intel knows that we don't really push our CPUs that far all the time. And when we do, Intel is just relying on throttling, you know, if you don't have an amazing cooler, to keep those temps under control and still maintain, you know, decent performance. The problem with this terrible, you know, inefficiency, that it kind of leaks into everyday type of stuff, to needing a pretty beefy air cooler just to keep it under control. Intel has just taken it a step too far. And even if you have a beefy cooler, you're still gonna be running your CPU pretty warm because it's just higher power. And that could probably lead to more chances of degradation. With that said, I think it's time we address the elephant in the room.
Please don't crash.
Intel CPUs have been destroying themselves, specifically the 13th and 14th gen CPUs. That's actually why I returned the first Intel CPU I bought. I was planning on doing this way back in May, when the news was starting to break about these Intel CPUs, and Intel and board partners were starting to take action on the matter. So you see, I originally bought a 12th gen 12700K because of how great of a deal that CPU is.
They're giving that away. 12700K for 230? Holy shit. Because those aren't that much slower than 13th gen.
No,
It's really pretty close.
12900 just beat the 13th gen overclocking record last night.
I mean, $230 for a 20-thread CPU that honestly still goes toe-to-toe with AMD's Ryzen 7000 series CPUs in gaming. That 12700K is a steal, no matter what way you slice it.
Did 150 for Lee and Lee fans that link together. 200.
And I traded that CPU in again at Micro Center, and I got the 13700K that you see here today. It's really to test out all the degradation situation. And what I can tell you from my experience, and probably possibly a part of why this video has taken so long to make, is because it's a mess. Intel has handled this so poorly, probably because of the catastrophic damages that could end up happening with all the RMAs and everything. Intel has been avoiding blame and making decisions that downplay the severity, even though people really should not be buying products that are destroying themselves. I've seen people have issues with Intel CPUs, 13th gen, 14th gen, in as little as just a few months. You see streamers out there running into these problems pretty consistently. Y'all know me though, I will happily buy this shit and not know if it's going to just die in a year and if it's going to blow up my power supply and take me with it. Most of my time with this Intel CPU has literally just been trying to decipher everything about this whole degradation situation. So for context, I have had 3 BIOS updates concerning the issues that Intel CPUs are having. The first one was released in early July, and it was called F7E. This one introduced the Intel Performance Power Profile, or whatever it's called, the new default profile that Intel is making standard across their motherboards. You know, generally speaking, Intel hasn't standardized what is going on for their CPUs and motherboards really at all, especially compared to what AMD does. AMD does a much better job on this. The old profile that was defaulted that everyone would use was the Gigabyte performance profile, obviously for my specific motherboard. It also, this new BIOS update, put us on microcode 125, which I don't really know what this 125 code does or was supposed to do, but you know, that is also a thing. The new Intel performance profile is just disappointing. And an all-core Cinebench workload, it's 6% slower by updating your BIOS. Plus the overall clock speed dropped from 4750 megahertz to 4500 megahertz while still drawing about the same amount of power. I've actually found this CPU to draw more power in certain cases. Generally speaking, other than that, gaming typically, they perform about the same, though it is usually a little bit slower on the Intel performance profile, if anything. So what I think Intel did here with this performance profile was take an opportunity to standardize a little bit with the motherboards, also to drop the clocks of their CPUs, because that's obviously what this did here, so that they are less likely to experience the effects of degradation. It's kind of like how Apple, you know, if you have an old iPhone or something, they start downclocking your CPU on your iPhone so it doesn't have issues with the battery life. It's really similar to that. It's just really scummy behavior, but I guess it's better to have a functional CPU that isn't destroying itself than to not have one at all. To note though, if you do want the old performance back, you can go back to the old performance profile, but you do have to go out of your way to do that. So Intel's, you know, probably covering their asses a little bit with this. The next BIOS was F7F, which was released on August 7th. What is interesting is this one was said to have the new microcode 129 and is supposed to correct what is actually causing degradation, not save CPUs, but prevent any further degradation. The issue it's specifically trying to fix is CPUs are apparently having massive voltage spikes whenever they start a heavy task. Jay made a great video demonstrating this with the microcode change. Gaming performance overall is about the same, which is pretty cool to see. Sometimes it's actually a little bit faster, at least from my testing. If this is accurate, I did do these tests at pretty different points in time, even with Windows updates and stuff. That part's worth considering, but it doesn't seem bad. As well as the all-core performance in like Cinebench and stuff is also pretty much the same. It doesn't really matter. So this microcode should help the issue on Intel CPUs and doesn't seem to have really any downside. The last BIOS and the most recent one was released on September 27th, and it's just called F7. So they took all the extra letters off of it. So I guess it's the quintessential fix for this Intel situation because it's the full F7 version. This update really wasn't expected at all because the previous one was supposed to fix and prevent any more degradation on CPUs, but apparently Intel is dumb or something, because after all this time that they've known about, they had to have known about this issue for like a year now. And they've just been la-la-laing around and they forgot about something to correct. Because basically, Intel noticed that CPUs, even when doing absolutely nothing, are still calling for insane voltages which destroys them. When they're just idling, doing nothing. What the f***? This doesn't sound like a lot, like it's just 1.4 volts or whatever, but let's compare it to the 7800X3D, where that CPU doesn't even crack 1 volt when it's idling, just doing nothing on the system. This is probably why the degradation has been happening so quickly on Intel CPUs, because even when your CPU is on, when your PC is running, it is actively destroying itself. The new BIOS introduces yet another microcode, 12B, which supposedly brings down the idle voltage requests on the CPU. The thing is though, it looks exactly the same to me. This new microcode doesn't look like it changed a damn thing. And though maybe this is something I can't test with the internal sensors that the software is giving me. Maybe you need a special tool to do this. What is cool, at least to me though, is that it doesn't look like the voltages are really that high enough on either microcode to be an issue. So I'm wondering exactly what this one does fix. What even sucks too is the new BIOS is even slightly slower than the older one. After all of these introductions of fixes to, you know, fix the degradation issues or reduce the effects they're going to have, Intel has overall made a 7% reduction or regression in all core performance. You're losing 7% of what you paid for in performance for this CPU because of all these mandatory updates to prevent your CPU from itself. Widens the gap further between this CPU in the 7800X3D, pushing you more towards the AMD side because of all these hits you take to performance. What is odd too is at least on Gigabyte's website, every time they updated, this whole degradation solution BIOS situation, the F7 one, all the ones that came before it that were F7 were deleted. Like you can't download the history of all of these changes that have taken place, deleted them like they don't exist. I think this really reflects how haphazard and messy all of these changes have been as they scramble to try and fix the CPUs. What's crazy is on top of this, you need these BIOS updates to protect your CPU as far as we know from it destroying itself. We don't even know if it does, but the average person is not going to be doing a BIOS update. I mean, I'm a turbo nerd. I get BIOS updates and everything. They're not actually that difficult to do or even that scary, but most people don't even know what the hell a BIOS is. CPUs from normal people are just going to be dying left and right. People will be frustrated, confused. They're gonna be like, oh, why is my CPU, my system, why is it just crapping out on itself all of a sudden?
Intel CPU? Brother, you're speaking a different language.
What I think is crazy is maybe Intel is hoping this will be a 5-head play, like a mega mind moment. Maybe this degradation problem, it would encourage people to upgrade the CPU earlier than they typically would. Awful thing, but that's what Intel is hoping they'll gain out of this. I don't think that's gonna work out for them, but makeshift plan at this point. This would be taking planned obsolescence of hardware to a whole nother level. This degradation problem has been awful and atrocious and whatever other terrible words you can think of, which is why I'm making a pretty bold decision. I'm gonna switch my main system over to Intel. I know you've seen all this testing throughout the video. That was never in my main system because I'm honestly kind of scared of this thing. But throughout all of my testing, the Intel CPU is kind of a beast, and it actually has turned into the fastest CPU that I own. You see, in my main system, I have a Ryzen 5900X, which is still a beast to this day, especially for a lot of things that I do. But at the same time, the 13700K is just a monster, and every single thing else is great in gaming, it's great in video editing, every kind of productivity. The only real problem is that power consumption and the fact that, hey, this thing could just itself. This is a huge risk for me because this is my main system. This is what I work on. This is what I do all the time. Now, maybe part of me also regrets, I guess I could have got a 13900K because my opinion was shifted over this. I was only getting a 13700K because I just wanted to try it. Here we are now. It is what it is. Also, the Intel CPU is just phenomenal value for your money. The problem with it is the platform upgrades and all that kind of stuff. Like, hey, Intel's LGA 1700 stock is just gonna kind of die here, so do you really want to invest into it? Where AM5 is probably gonna go on for years. But AM5 did just release Zen 5, which was kind of ass. So I don't know how many platforms of actual useful upgrades you're gonna get out of that. I'm buying into a dead platform here, but it is what it is. I feel like more the question of switching over to Intel is why? I mean, obviously I want to switch to it to test it long term for, just for science sake. But you look at the average person, it's like only 30% of people are going with Intel nowadays. And it's like, why is that? And I just want to give my overall thoughts because I've tested this Intel CPU a ton. I've been working with it since July at this point in time. It's been months now, actually way longer than I probably would have liked this video to take to make. But why would you go Intel? Because there's tons of downsides. And at the same time, AMD does everything that Intel does better, or if not at the same level as what Intel can do. While at the same time, AMD provides a platform that could last for a few generations, which means you could have an upgrade path into the future. And that's the whole thing is Intel, yes, it can game. Intel, yes, it can do production. It can do basically everything. It's a very versatile CPU, but it does have very high power consumption you have to work around. You have to buy a motherboard for basically one CPU because you're probably not going to upgrade to the next generation because each generation has been so lackluster. And even the timing of this video is pretty hilarious because Intel's newest generation, Arrow Lake, just came out, the Core Ultra 200 series, and those CPUs look like garbage. I'm not gonna lie, they're barely an upgrade. The only good thing is maybe a little bit better power consumption, but other than that, it doesn't seem like a major generation. Probably one that will lead to something in the future, but right now, it's just not that exciting. Intel CPUs, they're just not offering anything better than AMD. And I think that's how AMD has slowly become kind of the majority market share. And as we go into the future, I think more and more people, like average people in integrated systems and everything, will probably lean more towards AMD. I think this really explains, you know, paired with the whole degradation problem and RMAs and everything, why Intel's stock price has been kind of going down the shitter lately. I'm kind of switching to Intel for science because I want to check it. Also does a fast CPU, so like it's not like I'm really losing anything. And I still don't know why the normal person would really go Intel. There's just no reason to buy Intel. They don't have anything compelling about their architecture, about their generations. It's just not that exciting. I also want to just quickly give my overall thoughts here, because even since I recorded the last clip, I mean, this video has been such a monster thing to make. I've been editing like behind the scenes stuff, like with the side-by-sides and everything. I've been editing that. I've been editing this whole video itself for so long up to this point that it's been like a week, and I've been on Intel for like a full week now. So I just want to give some thoughts on it. Honestly, the system's been snappy, system's been fast. There's been no problems for me using it. Intel definitely works. It's like what I said towards the beginning of this video is, yeah, my first impressions of Intel, it's like it's definitely a functional platform. It's just not as good as what AMD's offering right now, so there's not really a reason to buy it. But Intel, it's still a good system. I've enjoyed my experience so far on it. I haven't had any problems or crashes. I've actually had less crashes than I did on my AMD system, but that's probably because that's a very old install of Windows. I think I had that one since like 2018 or something. Like, it is very old. I mean, it started on Windows 10, so yeah, it's an old install of Windows, so that's probably why it crashed a good bit and all that. I'll update you guys in the future of how this Intel switch goes. Maybe in like 6 months down the line, I'll be able to give you a more cohesive experience, cohesive update, and maybe track maybe some bugs I run into. Hopefully, I mean, fingers crossed that nothing happens and these microcode fixes do actually solve the CPU problems. Also, I don't know, and this is something that worries me, I don't know if I should go back to the Gigabyte performance profile or if I should stay on the Intel default settings. I don't know if the microcode fixed the issues with degradation and it doesn't matter what performance profile you're on. I don't know, because the Gigabyte one is faster, so I kind of want to go back to it, and it's actually more efficient than the Intel ones. I don't know what I should do there. So if you have an idea, let me know in the comments below. Hopefully the microcode fixes. I'd like to switch to that one in the future here. Or maybe I can manually tone my CPU, but this has been a monster video. I really hope you enjoyed. It's been really fun to put together, but also something I'm probably not going to tackle something this large in the future again, because holy shit, I've been working on this since like July and on and off, and I've had to really put it on the back burner because it's so big. I did way too much testing for this. A lot of testing you guys probably won't see the light of day on, but maybe I will make some follow-up videos about this Intel stuff in order to just kind of use this data and you know, be able to show it to you guys and see how you guys take it in and everything. See what I can make out of it. But yeah, this has been it for me. This Intel CPU. Wow, Intel is in a rough spot, and their newest generation is not making it look any better. I'm gonna see you guys in the next video. Have a good one. Good luck if you're on an Intel CPU. You probably won't survive. All right, peace. I hope I survived.